Hello and welcome to week one. And this is going to be just a quick video discussion to go over a little bit of the definitions and to make sure we're all on the same page discussing terrorism, what terrorism is, what it's not, and how it compares to, say, uh, other crime. You know, how a terrorist organization would compare to a criminal organization, how the goals differ and whatnot. So, although we're using the book that we talked about in the introduction, the terrorism textbook, the terrorism textbook actually references another person, another author's book, which I found interesting. Bruce Hoffman, he wrote a book called Inside Terrorism in 1998, and a lot of the information that we'll be discussing today is going to come out of that book specifically. So, if you do decide to reference this presentation, you can either make a citation in accordance with YouTube citations on this video, or you can reference the textbook that we have, or if you really want to dig deep, you can reference Bruce Hoffman's Inside Terrorism 1998. It'll be your choice. So let's talk about what terrorism is and what it's not. So how it differs from regular crime as we kind of compare and contrast going back and forth. Terrorism is primarily political. When somebody aims to commit a terrorist act, it is usually not so much the way that a criminal per se would have a line of thinking where I want to get some sort of financial gain. A terrorist organization or a terrorist individual committing an act of terror aims to have some sort of political change as opposed to a financial gain. They do this, they're either going to have a violent act, or even worse, or I should say, almost as often, a threat of a violent act, because that can be equally as effective. Having a violent act, or even threatening to have a violent act, you can bring about change either way. You don't actually have to go through with your act of terror in order to be successful as a terrorist organization. But that can also be attributed to criminals as well. If somebody's going to commit a street robbery and they bring a gun to a street robbery, the perceived threat is that if the victim doesn't give up the property that the criminal wants, then the criminal will use that gun in an act of violence. But how often does that gun actually get used? It's the threat of the violence that is usually leads to success in that criminal act. So in that sense, criminal organizations and terror organizations have a similar MO. Terrorists, also their terror acts, they're designed to have far-reaching psychological repercussions. So not just to the victim. A criminal, I'm going to bounce back to criminal organizations, that street robbery. A street robbery is meant to get that victim's property at that specific time. There is no far-reaching goal. You're not trying to change a neighborhood or something like that. Whereas an act of terror is meant to not only affect the specific victims of that act of terror, but also to have more far-reaching, those psychological repercussions to people beyond the victim or the target of that terror act, because it's such a large event and such a newsworthy event, and the causes of the perceived slights or the causes, the grievances that are causing that terror act to occur are made known, that the whole community, the whole society, the whole country that is affected by that particular act of terror is also a victim, not just the folks who were injured in the act of terror. And then finally, terror organizations are normally not countries in and of themselves. They're usually subnational or non-state entities, they're called. So an organization within a country could commit a terror act, but if an organization like a nation commits an act of terror, that would be an act of war more than an act of terror. So those are just the pure definitions. And we'll talk more about those definitions. And if you want to add to them or argue some of the merits of those definitions, I think that'd be a great discussion in our discussion board posts, because just because Bruce Hoffman put it in his textbook doesn't mean that they're gospel, and doesn't mean they can't be discussed even further. If you think that a country can commit an act of terror, then by all means, I'd love to hear that, and I'd love to have that discussion. Or if you think that violence is more of a terror act than the threat of violence, that's a great discussion. So let's look forward to those discussions. The other half of what I wanted to talk about today is the tactics that terror organizations or individuals that commit acts of terror employ. So first of all, we already said that it's politically motivated. So in order to be politically motivated, to fulfill that motivation, then whoever's committing that act of terror needs to bring attention to whatever perceived grievance or cause that's making them want to make their cause known. So they do that by committing an act of terror or a widely made threat, and they're using media coverage, especially nowadays with the widening media footprint. A terror organization will use the media coverage that comes with these sensational acts to get their message across. They don't have to reach every person. They can allow their act to become a newsworthy event, the act of terror, to become a newsworthy event, and then release the cause for that act. And now they've gotten their message across to far, far more people than they would have reached in their own little sphere of influence. The whole rationale for violence or threats of violence is intimidation. They want to have a reaction in public, a widely seen, a widely experienced reaction that causes fear and intimidation. That's how change comes about. Because the whole point of a terror act, an act of terror, whether it be from an organization or an individual, the whole reason is that they want to affect change through threats of further continued violence until the grievance they have is either acted upon or changed. They want to affect some sort of change so that they get the world to become the way they want it to be. And the only way, or the best way, the most efficient way that they've decided to do that is through acts of terror, through making people scared until they change their behavior. So those are your basic definitions and tactics. I wanted to just kind of make sure we're on the same page going into chapter 1, going into our assignments. I look forward to seeing your discussion board posts. Make sure they are posted by Monday and that your responses are posted by Friday. It'll give your classmates an opportunity to respond to you. Remember, 300 words for your initial at least, and 2 references. The reference can either be this video, it can be your textbook or outside sources. Just make sure there's 2 of them and that your in-text citations match your reference page. If you have any questions, by all means, reach out to me, and I look forward to reading your submissions.